Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today is April 5th, and I'm doing a webcast today, a video blog here about the planet Saturn. There's been a number of difficult Saturn transits lately, and I've been getting a lot of emails from people and a lot of comments on my blogs, video blogs, newsletters, basically saying, when is it going to end? When are the Saturn aspects going to be over? You're telling me there's another one to come. Oh my God, people really don't like Saturn aspects. Saturn is a difficult planet. So I'm making this video blog today called 3 Things to Remember Before Hating on Saturn. Hating on Saturn could take the form of being like, oh God, no, another Saturn thing, or oh my God, it's a Saturn return, or when is it going to be over, or basically any internal relationship that you start developing with Saturn that's inherently negative. The reason that this isn't healthy, for starters, is because all of the planets are divine emissaries. They are representatives of the supreme will. They're representative of the mind of God. These are different ways that astrologers have talked about the planets for thousands of years. They are reflective of a divine intelligence and unfolding in our life, and all of them are sacred. And so in everyday life, on some levels, it's fun to talk about the planets and, oh my God, Mercury's retrograde, and we can speak like that. But sometimes we, in our joking and so forth, 2 things happen. One, we start to identify ourselves with the material, mundane world. We get associated with mundane life and our mundane dramas, our everyday dramas. We get wrapped up in them. And to the extent that we spend a lot of time talking about, oh my God, Mercury, or oh my God, this, or oh my God, that, we can get overly sort of enmeshed within the soap operas of our lives. And then the planets are no longer teachers. They're no longer here to give us something. They're no longer pointing the way back home to our hearts. They're no longer a bridge to spirit or to the divine. Instead, they're like a red light at a traffic circle, or they're something that we're waiting on to get out of our way, and we don't want that kind of attitude. And the other thing that they can do is they can, when we talk about the planets that way, when we get really wrapped up in, this planet's giving me a real pain in the butt and I don't like this one, but oh God, I've had a nice Jupiter transit or whatever. When we get into that way of thinking and talking about the planets, even though I'm not saying we should outlaw it, right? Because we're human and we don't want to be like so severe or anything, but we have to be careful, because the other thing that happens when we do that is the planets don't talk to you. When you talk to them that way, they don't talk to you, because we forget that they're living beings. Sometimes we think of them as mechanical symbols, just as rote and mechanical as we think of the rain or the weather patterns, right? It's just stuff that's happening. It's predictable. It's mechanical. We think about it like that. But for ancient people, these were gods or demigods. And the rains and the seasons and the floods and the storms were also the will and activities of the demigods. So the connection to the divine and the sacred is much more active when we keep active respect in our language and in our mind for these planetary symbols. If you think of them in the Greek world, for example, Kronos was called, that's Saturn, was called the star of Kronos. So it was thought of as a representative of a god, right? And that's really profound. And that was not, nowadays we've all read a little Joseph Campbell, right? And I love Joseph Campbell. And we've all taken a literary course or two, on literary symbolism. And so we think of these as symbols. And we think of them as symbols of things that are happening in my head that are maybe as simple as, mechanical, biochemical patterns or something like that. But it's really helpful to get out of that way of thinking, because it takes away. I mean, when you start thinking of the planets as sacred, as connected to the living forces of soul and spirit and the divine forces flowing through all of reality, it's much harder to sort of take them too lightly, and then they stop talking to you. So that's the second thing, is the planets want to be respected because they're living forces. The entire book of the Vedas in ancient astrology, the Vedas are some of the oldest sacred scriptures in the world that we have, and they're astrological in nature. It's not quite horoscopic astrology like we have today, but they're astrological in nature. And the way that they're treating the heavens is as filled with higher intelligences that are presiding over nature, and it's really serious. And even though today we have a lot of things that can, sort of empirically explain to us the interactions of physical stuff and why it's happening, no one's telling us how that's happening or why it's happening, right? So then we can tell us that the big bang maybe occurred at some point, but you can't say exactly who caused it or why it happened, And similarly, we can say, well, it's going to rain, or it's going to snow, or it's going to do this, or it's going to do that. It's freezing here today, which is why I have my scarf on. But we can't say exactly why that's happening, so to speak. So in my practice, I really try to stay sacred with the names of the planets. And, I joke around for fun, but I come back to remembering that the forces that we are playing with when we're really super casual with our language actually have ears, and, a different kind of ear. But for example, in the Vedas, the way to connect with these forces was through mantra, was through sound. And so the sound of our voice, the things that we have to say, matter. So before we go hating on Saturn, cursing Saturn, here are some things to think about. There's 3 things we're going to talk about. But before we get into those 3 things, I want to talk a little bit about why Saturn, why not Mars, or why not Pluto or any other planet? Why am I picking Saturn today? And the basic reason for that is that we've had a bunch of Saturn transits lately. So we've had a heavy dose of Saturn. We just had Mars conjunct Saturn. That's an intense transit. We had the Sun square to Mars and Saturn from Aries. That's intense. We had Mercury square Mars and Saturn. And then now through retrograde, we've had Mercury square Mars and Saturn. We had the Sun entrapped between Mars and Saturn. We just had Mercury entrapped between Mars and Saturn. And over the weekend, we're about to have Venus go through the entrapment between Saturn and Mars. Even though it's a benefic trine, it's still a little bit of a little heavy dose of Saturn. Mars and Saturn are in Saturn's sign. Okay, so it's and we don't like Saturn. Most of us subjectively don't like Saturnine experiences, but we really have to examine why it is that we don't like Saturnine experiences before we start cursing Saturn. So why don't we like Saturnine experiences? Saturn's natural places, Aquarius and Capricorn, are opposite the signs of the lights, the luminaries, the sun and the moon. Leo, the sign of the sun, is opposite Aquarius, sign of Saturn, and Cancer, sign of the moon, is opposite Capricorn, the other sign of Saturn. So that's a natural way that the planetary rulerships are set up. They are opposite one another, and it's said that Saturn is the planet associated with oppositions in astrology in general. So Saturn is the lord of opposition because the planet that rules the signs opposite the sun and the moon are Saturn. Now, if you want to test this out on other aspects, you can do the same thing. For example, if you go to the signs to the left in the zodiacal wheel, putting sun and the moon at the bottom of the chart, like the ancient astrologers did, and kind of going to the left of the moon, you get two to the left. The sextile to the moon in Cancer is Taurus. If you go to the right of Leo, it's Libra. So the sextiles for the sun and the moon both go to Venus-ruled signs, and said that sextile is of the nature of Venus. Similarly, if you go to the squares to the sun and the moon, you go from Cancer to the first square of the moon. To the left, it's Aries. To the right of the sun, it's Scorpio. Those are the Mars-ruled signs, and the square is said to be of the nature of Mars. Go to the trines, you get to Pisces from the moon, and you get to Sagittarius from the sun, and those are Jupiter-ruled signs. The trine is said to be of the nature of Jupiter. And then finally, when you get to the oppositions, there's Saturn. That's the opposition. Saturn is opposite both of the lights, Saturn signs. So Saturn represents, in contrast to light, which is also associated with life and growing things, it is related to darkness. It is the most liminal, farthest planet out and the darkest, dimmest planet. So you have a planet that is related to darkness. Whereas the sun is related to the light of knowledge, clarity, and wisdom, Saturn is related to ignorance. Whereas the lights represent unimpeded growth, Saturn is related to limitation and constriction. Whereas the sun and the moon represent inclusion and things like groups and families and a sense of egoic self-importance or individuality. Saturn is about outsiders and outcasts, the people who are dejected, lonely, isolated, removed, abandoned, things that are neglected. Life, Saturn represents death. Youthfulness in the lights, old age with Saturn. Health in the lights, disease with Saturn. Factions with Saturn, whereas you have unity with the lights. These all come from ancient texts. Separation from Saturn, removing things versus bringing them together with the lights. Worry with Saturn, whereas you have comfort with things like the moon. You have numbness with Saturn, ice, coldness, winter, dryness, whereas you have spring and summer with the lights. So naturally, these are not our favorite things, right? Just naturally. But we have to ask again, why are these qualities not our favorite things? Like, why don't we love these things? And I'll say a few things about this. So naturally, we don't love Saturn things because Saturn tends to remind us of those qualities, those experiences in life that our ego doesn't generally love or enjoy, right? That's just a basic truth. So let's identify what is our ego. Let's make it really simple. People have written long books about this, right? So what is the ego? The ego is your sense of body. It's temporary. It's a temporary home and temporary vehicle for the soul. Your personality, your psychology, your temperament, all things linked to this body. Your family, your home, your history, your background, all of that stuff in this lifetime will eventually fade away and die. Now, so all of that stuff, when we really identify ourselves with that level of our existence, which is a valid and important level of our existence, I'm not trying to say that it's, just dispose it, it's unusable, it's evil or something like that, right? But when we're totally identified with that level of our reality, then we don't like anything that threatens it. And all of the things that we just mentioned about Saturn generally threaten that level of our existence. Health versus old age, decline, disease, etc. Easy, light, experiences versus hard work, right? It's like, these are the kinds of things that, generally speaking, the ego level of our reality, which is multifaceted. It's not just like some kind of, like, sometimes we think of ego and you just think of someone with a big ego, but really all of us have if you think of the temporary vehicle, the personality and the ego that we each have is like the temporary gardener or the temporary like the pujari of a temple that the soul lives in, right? So ultimately, like Carl Jung said and so many other mystics have said, we're trying to get the ego to be in service of the soul. And the soul, what have mystics told us about the soul? The life of the soul is qualitatively different from the life of the ego, primarily because the ego and the body die. So we have naturally a tendency to get more identified with the temporary elements of our identity, but we also have souls. What is a soul? Well, again, what have mystics, some different traditions, told us about the reality of the soul? That it is unborn and undying, that it doesn't have a beginning, that it doesn't have an end, that it is eternal. And so this temporary level of reality may not like Saturn, because Saturn naturally relates to the stages in life and nature on an archetypal level that are about contraction and death and the difficult things that threaten the temporary home of the ego. But our spirit souls don't have to be threatened by those things. For example, one of the famous texts, one of the cornerstones of my own spiritual practice, the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says when Arjuna is really suffering on the battlefield, considering whether or not he should go to war in this really difficult situation that he's in, he's really lamenting over having to potentially go to war, right? And Krishna says, you're lamenting over something that really on the level of the soul doesn't matter, because nobody here on this battlefield can actually die. Nobody here on this battlefield was actually ever born. And it's just like, it's like a dimensional shift of consciousness that has to occur to like sort of understand that. But that's the basic idea. So we have this shift of awareness that happens when we shift into our soul. And spiritual experiences put us in touch with the soul. There's innumerable different kinds of spiritual experiences, right? But everyone knows what one is like when you start realizing, yeah, I'm not this body, and I'm not this ego, and these things are here, they're real, they're a part of me, but ultimately I'm something else. I have an eternal identity. So when that happens, and when we're looking at Saturn from the position of the soul and its eternalness, eternality, how can the soul start to perceive and experience Saturn? And remember, the idea is that the planets are operating as teachers on behalf of the divine, or they're emissaries of the planets, are the emissaries of the gods, or they are, you can also think of them, especially in Indian astrology, as the sort of agents of the supreme will, the supreme intelligence, etc. So when you think about them like that, then you're like, okay, so if all those things that Saturn represents have some good to teach or guide or offer the soul, then how can I reconfigure my understanding of Saturn so that I have a healthier relationship with it, and so that I'm not walking around sort of cursing Saturn? So these are the three things. Three simple ways of thinking about Saturn that can help you kind of pause and stop before going into, oh my God, Saturn, I hate Saturn, da da da. Okay, so Saturn as the word no. It's a very simple word that Saturn represents, is the word no. From the perspective of the unborn, undying, eternal soul that's here, and it's deeply mysterious why we're here. I mean, that's you'd say you live life to learn more about the soul. Like Heraclitus said, the soul is explored forever to a depth beyond report. But we're here on a journey, a soulful journey, to experience things in these forms that we're in, right? So most people who do astrology on some level believe that. That's why they go to an astrologer and say, tell me about why I'm here. It's the soul that wants to know, like, who am I as a soul, and why am I here? What is my relationship? What is my constitutional position in reality? And how do I do this thing called living? Why am I doing it? Well, Saturn, as a teacher of the soul, in its transits, tells us that whenever we get the word no, we're actually being shaped fundamentally into more of who we are. So there's a great quote from James Hillman that goes like this. He's an archetypal psychologist. He says, as I've grown older, I've come to realize that the curses, the frustrations, and the character faults visited on me by Saturn mean something completely different than what I thought when I was younger. I took them literally as curses, and I cursed my stars for not giving me what I believed I needed and wanted. That is, I cursed Saturn, to use the old language. But it isn't Saturn who curses us. We curse him. We make him into that poor, shunned, limping old god because we don't understand his mode of blessing us. What a curse it must be to keep giving gifts that are received as punishments. The faults and frustrations he visits on us are his way of keeping us true to our particular image. No way out. The old lore attributed the last years of life to Saturn. That makes sense. Only now can I begin to reconcile myself with and not rebel against what I am and what I am not. So there he is saying, look, what Saturn's really doing when you feel all jacked up by Saturn is keeping you true to the actual soul image that you're here to experience in this lifetime, sometimes called the daimon, or different people have talked about it differently, but it's that feeling that I'm here to be and do something specific, to have a specific kind of experience. And the soul doesn't judge. What did the yogis tell us about the soul? They say that from the standpoint of the soul, everything is experienced as eternal knowledge, happiness, freedom, and bliss. So all of these experiences from the standpoint of the eternal soul are experienced in a state of intelligence, bliss, freedom. They're profoundly deep and wonderful experiences, all of them without discrimination. And so and that's a point that Hillman made in his work over and over again, that the soul relishes all different kinds of experiences, the good and the bad. But the ego, the sense of me and my will and what I want and what I don't want and everything like that, it tends to fight against the experiences that the soul sometimes has come here to experience. And so we have this really interesting relationship unfolding between our egos and our souls, right? And all different kinds of mystics have told us about this. But what Hillman is saying here is that your soul, when it experiences a Saturnine curse, is actually receiving a blessing, because you are being shaped into more of the soul that you are. The no is like the carving and chiseling of a great artist working a piece of stone into a specific shape. And so Saturn, that can feel on a certain level, can feel painful. But when we enter with great courage into the heart of our most difficult lessons, we find a hidden yes. And it's very profound. What it can do for us spiritually, the way that it can evolve, shape, and confirm. It can say yes to things. But we have to get into the paradoxical space of the soul where every no is also a yes. And that doesn't happen unless we're living from the perspective of the soul. And living from the perspective of the soul takes daily practice. We have to be in the practice of nurturing the life of the soul. And that happens differently for different people. But as a yoga studio owner, I can't help but be like, hey, everyone, try meditation and yoga. It really helps. Anyway, Saturn also represents separation and isolation, right? So there's a big theme with Saturn around being alone, being outcast, being an outsider, being different, being isolated. Well, another way of experiencing isolation from the perspective of the soul, and this is a very big thing in Bhakti yoga, which happens to be sort of the specific form of yoga that I study, is and practice, is that love can't happen without separation. So much of our culture feeds us images of the consummation of things. Everything is a happily ever after, everything is like, there's advertisements that you see. Like there was one that I heard someone talking about recently. It was about Coca-Cola, and it said, drink happiness, or it was like, open a can of happiness or something like that. So the consumer culture that we're living in is always telling us that we can have instant, total, almost eternal satisfaction if we buy something or take something into our system or whatever. And we're basically told the same thing about loving other people. Oh, you fall in love, happily ever after. I'm going to find my soulmate. And I know that this is a true problem that people have, because for as many clients as I see per year, 50% come hoping for a soulmate. And they have riding on that hope everything. You know what I mean? You can feel it. But what's really riding on that hope is the need and desire to connect with the soul, because the soul is already eternal, always has been, always will be. What we're looking for really is soulful experience. Love, real intimate love between ourselves, between each other, and between the soul and the divine, it needs separation to occur. It needs a space across which to relate for the possibility of intimacy to exist. So separation is a necessary part. This is, in some sense, why we're here. Saturn is a planet that is connected by many astrologers over time to the idea of the fall of man, because it's opposite the lights of the sun and the moon. We get kicked out of the Garden of Eden in the myth. In all of the myths, there's in metaphysical, mystical schools, there's always some sense of, well, how did we get to be here in a body where we tend to identify with a temporary body and ego and forget all about the soul, who's already eternal, who already has an eternal relationship with the divine? How do we forget about that, right? But the answer here is that, well, you have free will, and B, separation and free will together are the necessary ingredients for the choice to cultivate love and intimacy with everything. They have to be there. So when you have a Saturnine experience, you feel isolated, lonely, disappointed, you're grieving. It's actually, if you can just feel into it from the perspective of the soul, those experiences are validating the reality of love, of intimacy, of free will, of choice. Because when you feel thwarted, it's evidence that you have a free will that you've been using that has been thwarted. So there you are, a free being. When you feel separate, isolated, thwarted, or blocked, it's also evidence that it is possible to feel another way, that it's possible to feel love, right? And that instantly, it doesn't just say, well, then sometime in the future, maybe they'll get back there. If you tap into that, to the realization that the blockage links you immediately back to the thing that you long for in your heart and in consciousness, then immediately every no once again becomes a yes. Every isolation becomes intimacy. Every separation becomes the burning of love in your heart. And that's all you have to do, is just shift your consciousness to experience the no and the limitation as evidence of the love. The disappointment is the burning of the lover for the beloved. So that's a blessing. And if we can feel it that way, we become freer, not more limited, but we become radically more free through finding freedom within limitation. Right? So that's another reason you got to really not curse. We really can't curse Saturn. Now, finally, we have Saturn representing, harsh consequences, harsh lessons, severity. Well, another way of looking at it is like, sometimes the Lord of Karma comes calling. You get a tough lesson, you get a harsh consequence, you get a slap on the wrist from the universe, and that feels really Saturnine. It feels like, God, I don't want like some kind of martial punishment. I don't want martial law in the universe. So sometimes we try to, sort of pad the difficult learning moments. We try to, rather than shifting our consciousness about how we experience harshness and severity, instead we try to make it all light and basically like bunnies and unicorns, right? What's the problem with this? Well, it's not that I'm not against positivity, optimism, beauty, grace, forgiveness. Those are all good qualities. But the truth is that severity and sort of karmic consequences exist. They're real. And so we have to, in that Saturn, the real, right? So how do we change or shift our relationship to punishment or to discipline or to rigor or to harshness or severity or the difficult lessons? How do we shift our experience with those things so, again, we're experiencing them from the perspective of the already eternal soul that we are? Well, in those most difficult lessons, we also have tangible evidence of benevolence, goodness, rightness, and something that is saying to us, you should be doing something else. So every time you get a harsh lesson, like let's say you date someone once again that you know you shouldn't date, but this time the consequences are more severe. You lose a ton of money. You actually blow a really good job opportunity, and all because you did the same thing over again with dating someone you shouldn't have and wasting a bunch of time and wasting your potential or something like that, right? That happens to us. Okay. So there's consequences. We all have this, where there's like penalties in life. But in the penalty is, if you sink into it and accept it with a spirit of gratitude, and again, a kind of courageous, romantic spirit, and if you insert a yes into it, what you find out is that in the middle of that is also what is right and what is good and what is true. And so that's something that, to remember, that if Saturn's giving you a little bit of a tough lesson, just remember that it's also evidence that there actually is something good. And if that doesn't generate complete love, awe, and admiration in your heart, then really what we're doing is we're suffering the consequence rather than being grateful for it. And there's profound gratitude available to us in every hard lesson or difficult Saturnine experience that comes our way. So paradoxically, the most severe, austere, difficult kinds of Saturnine experience can again be opportunities for profound bliss. When you can find bliss, happiness, and eternity in the hard lessons of life, when you can learn to see reflected within them the spirit of something divine and profound, you also learn that you need less. In all of these situations, right? One of the things that happens in the midst of a Saturnine experience is that, okay, you've gotten a no. Oh, okay, but I can turn the no. I can experience yes within a no. Wow, that's profound. Okay, then you've limited me. Oh, but I can experience freedom within limitation. Okay, that's profound. Or I can experience rightness, goodness, truth, and love within the midst of something difficult, severe, or a little bit harsh. Wow, if I can experience those things within limitation, isolation, and no, then guess what I come away from? I become more mature as a being. I become more mature, and one of the byproducts is that I need less. I don't go craving and hungry for so many things, because what I realize is that I have everything that I need always in every experience that comes my way. Anything and everything that comes my way. When I learn how to shift my consciousness into that kind of courageous space of seeing divinity reflected in it, then immediately I need less. And that's why Saturn is also connected with austerity. But you have to remember that for most people, traditionally austerity is the seed bed of devotion. But some people don't understand that, because they just think of austerity as like limiting yourself. Well, I'm going to cut out, all of the bad stuff in my diet, overnight, and it ends up having this super harsh effect on my body. Like, that's not austerity, right? Right? That'd be like self-punishment. That's not the same thing. If you think of austerity, like for example, there's a famous prayer in India called basically it's the Brahma Samhita. It's like the prayer of Lord Brahma when he's creating the universe, and he goes through an incredibly long period of austere meditation. But in the midst of that long period of austerity, he realizes the fruit of the contractive, basically thousands of years worth of contractive focus and concentrated meditation and not doing anything else, and he's really focused. And it's kind of like a little contractive prison cell. But what comes out of it is he understands his position as the creator of the universe, because he realizes that he is made of the image of God and that he loves God, and then comes bursting out the universe, right? So it's profound. Similarly, again, not to say that everyone should go embrace harsh austerities. What we're really saying is that there are natural periods of time in life that are a little bit more austere or difficult. And when we accept those times and be stubborn about finding love, we end up drawing water from the rock. We end up pulling soul out of something that looks like soul should not be there. We end up pulling happiness out of places that we think happiness shouldn't be there. This is also why Saturn is not only just austerity, but is also a teacher, is also wisdom, and is also someone who undeniably connected to light. So it's not oppositions, going back to the very beginning, opposition between the sun, moon, and Saturn is also fundamentally about the relationship between darkness and light in this material world. So these are good things to remember before going and really complaining about Saturn. So at any rate, I hope this has been interesting for everybody. I'm going to look through some of the comments here and see if there's anything else I can say. All right, let's see here. Okay. This is what has been weighing heavily on me lately. Good way to look at it. Okay, good. A little crying is okay. A little crying is allowed. We've had some tough times with Saturn lately. Sometimes you have to, you have to be, Saturn is kind of stubborn and hard. You have to meet Saturn and say, you know what? I'm going to find my love in my heart, and I'm going to find eternity in your midst right now. I'm not giving up. I'm not going to wait for the future. I'm not going to wait until Saturn passes, because I trust that you're God too. You know what I mean? It takes a radical kind of trust to go into that space with Saturn, but we have to if we're going to really draw the wisdom of Saturn. Saturn is connected to mystics. Saturn is said by some astrologers to rule astrology. So this is why. All right, Dawn says the separation is the burning of the lover for the beloved. Beautiful thought. Yeah, to me that's at the really the foundation of Bhakti Yoga. And Sabine, oh good, I'm glad to hear that, Sabine. Date someone you should not. Saturn is living in my house. Okay, well, good luck with that. Saturn is tough love. I wouldn't say tough love. A lot of times when we think of tough love, you think of someone like punching you in the face and then being like, you needed that. There's no malice in Saturn, right? You have to think of Saturn as kind of cool and detached even. We experience it's like, for example, I'll just give you an example. Like when I was in college, I got really into lacrosse, and I really wanted to be a part of something, right? I really wanted to be like, I didn't fit in really great in high school, and when I got into college, I wanted to do something that helped me like fit in. So I played lacrosse, right? And as I was playing lacrosse, I was really exerting all of my effort into fitting into that group and becoming like a good lacrosse player. And but I broke my arm, a compound fracture of my humerus in my left arm. And I remember at the time, sort of cursing my luck because suddenly I couldn't play lacrosse anymore. But I was a Christian in a Christian school, and I had the feeling that God, at first I thought, well, the fact that I'm focusing on something rather superficial like a sport rather than cultivating my spiritual life, I'm getting punished right now, right? No, I'm not getting punished. That my free will decided to play a really violent sport rather than focusing on spiritual things. I'm allowed to do that with my free will. However, that was the consequence, right? But it took me a while to get to that point where it's not like, oh, that was tough love. No, that's real love, to be able to let me choose what I want to do and to choose love or not. So that's how I would look at it. So at any rate, and what did that do? What did the arm break do? Well, I couldn't play sports, so I started getting really deeply into my devotional spiritual journey, which is why I'm here. The choices that I made in light of not being a part of that were really the beginning of my spiritual path. So, and I think a lot of people have stories like that. So I wouldn't call it tough love. Too many negative associations with that. Margaret says, I have Herculean challenges. Sometimes flower essences and homeopathy helps me. Good. Profound gratitude is available within the hard lessons of life. Yes, definitely. You have to have some kind of irrational confidence and courage to do that, right? To say, I'm grateful for every experience, or yes, thank you. It's really difficult to do, especially with a planet that we are so tempted to take as a literal no. Saturn as the literal devil. Right? And so we curse Saturn. We curse Saturn, then Saturn doesn't communicate with us. Saturn just becomes what we say that it is, a curse. Saturn is in 5th house now on my natal moon. Oh, man, yeah. Well, be good to your body right now, especially, and sleepiness, grogginess, heaviness, especially with Saturn on the moon. That can be a little bit of a struggle. So take good care of yourself and try to the austerity of the moment will pass, and look, see if you can find the well within it. Lots of mystics, by the way, like Mother Teresa, has had a dark night of the soul. You know what I mean? Like profoundly heart-centered, compassionate individuals go through very dark and challenging experiences. And we all have to pass someday too. That's not easy. Cindy says, I've been experiencing this a lot in my work. I've been doing work that has not been fulfilling, and I've gotten away from the work that is, and so consequentially, everything has become infinitely more difficult. As a result, I'm practically running with my hair on fire toward the work that is fulfilling and revamping it at that. Good. Yeah, that's the thing is, sometimes we have free will. And so sometimes discovering what we are not is the single biggest blessing ever, because it keeps honing that sense of exactly who we are in this, this incarnation, this soul image that we're here to explore. You say separation is essential and exists. okay, what happens from time to time with a sense of at oneness and illusion? That's a really good and deep metaphysical question. It's obviously different traditions handle that differently, right? In the tradition that I study, the metaphysical concept is called the Chinta Beta Beta, which means inconceivable, simultaneous oneness and difference. So as souls in the Bhakti tradition, we are parts of God, but independent, though also of the exact same nature. And so the simultaneous oneness and difference between the soul and God facilitates infinite blissful relationships between God's creations, quote unquote, because they're never really created in a time-bound sense. They're all already eternal. But it facilitates infinite loving experiences between soul and God that are both qualitatively the same, but also sort of ontologically separate. So inconceivable oneness and difference at the same time. So I hope that, I mean, that's, you don't have to believe that. That's the metaphysical school that I get down with, that you might be hearing come through my language. This was a great cosmic pep talk. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Connie. I'm glad you're here. Saturn is like the pressure that forms the diamond. I like that. Yeah, really cool. Patricia says, I asked a question of a person last weekend, got a no when hoping for a yes, but was actually relieved to at least have an answer one way or another and see it as a soft no. Yeah, totally. Sometimes in my my chanting practice, I chant japa, and in my chanting practice, sometimes I'll be really stressed and anxious about something. And what I'll do in my practice is start basically looking at the two outcomes. Let's say there's two outcomes. I'll start looking at the two outcomes, and I'll start saying to the one that I don't want or that I'm afraid of, I'll say, if that's the one that comes, then I know that that is the will and beauty of the divine. And so what do I want more than that? And I have to challenge myself to go there. It's not always easy, right? But that's where I go, and it instantly changes my relationship to the anxiety. It instantly changes my relationship to the outcome, to just go right into a heart of trust and be like, if it's not the thing that I want, then it is the thing that I want, because I want whatever it is that is meant and designed for me. And I don't believe ultimately that I'm in control of everything. I believe I have some free will here, right? But when it comes to outcomes that are beyond my control, right? And I can't control, I'm just in the practice of surrendering like that. And I think it's really important. I think that's what happens when you're in a tight Saturnine space too. Surrender becomes accessible. Surrender is an amazing, one of the most amazing things about freedom that we don't realize is that the soul is eternally free already. So sometimes we mistakenly think that freedom has to do with my free will in the material sense. We have free will in the material sense, but the nature of real freedom is that we're not getting looped into the results and cycles of the material world. So the way to retain real freedom is in that surrender. That's where we actually experience freedom. The experience of freedom and the use of free will are different experiences. So anyway, I'm going to end here because we're at about 45 minutes right now, and I need to go. It's spring cleaning time. I need to go clean my basement today. So that's what I'm going to do next. All right, you guys have a wonderful week, and thanks for tuning in. Bye, everyone.